Before the world knew of elite shadow units, the government recruited a man who officially did not exist. They weren't looking for a soldier, but a ghost capable of breaking a German battalion without ever pulling a trigger. This is the redacted story of Naki Yazi, the warrior history tried to erase, whose silence changed the course of the war. Naki Yazi, in the autumn of 1941, was a quiet shepherd tending to his family's flock under the endless blue canopy of the Sonoran sky. Naki possessed a stillness that mirrored the ancient mesas surrounding the San Carlos Apache reservation. His grandfather saw a rare ability in the boy to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. He taught Naki that to truly see, one must first learn to be invisible. They would spend days in the wilderness, where the old man would challenge the youth to approach a resting deer closely enough to touch its flank, without the animal ever sensing a human presence. It was a mastery of presence that would soon be called upon by a nation in desperate need of a miracle. On a Tuesday morning in early December, just days after the smoke had cleared from Pearl Harbor, a black government sedan interrupted the quiet rhythm of the reservation. Two men in olive drab uniforms requested an audience with the tribal council. They were not looking for standard infantry. They were looking for the ghosts of the Southwest, whose ancestors had held off entire armies using nothing but the terrain. They saw a young man with calm eyes who seemed to be listening to a frequency they could not hear. The officers offered him a choice: stay in the safety of the desert, or take the ancient wisdom of his people to a place where the shadows were growing long and cold. Naki looked at his grandfather, who gave a single slow nod. As the young man packed a small leather satchel, he grabbed a handful of red earth from the foot of the mountains, a piece of home to anchor him in the storms to come. He stepped into the vehicle, leaving behind his world to enter one that would soon lose its breath at the mention of his name. The journey toward the secret training grounds of Fort Huachuca had begun, marking the first step of a path that would lead him into the heart of a European winter. While the army was prepared to teach him the mechanics of modern warfare, they had no idea that Naki was about to teach them the true meaning of the word unseen. At Fort Huachuca, the United States Army teaches you how to shoot, but in the hidden box canyons of the Arizona borderlands, the elders teach you how to disappear. While thousands of young men were learning to march in unison, Naki Yazi was taken to a place that appeared on no official map. This was a world of jagged rock that would break a common soldier, yet to Naki it felt like a sacred extension of his own home. Here, military instructors yielded to 3 Apache elders, whose presence commanded a silence more profound than any drill sergeant's bark. These men were not interested in the volume of a man's fire, but in the weight of his footfall. The training was an exercise in sensory awakening. Naki was tasked with the fear walk, a discipline designed to turn a man into a living shadow. He moved through miles of sun-baked brush, terrain that should have rattled with every step, without making a sound heard from 5 feet away. He spent his nights practicing the art of the belly crawl, learning to breathe in rhythm with the wind so his lungs would not betray him. He discovered that by softening his gaze, he could detect the slightest shimmer of movement in the darkness, a skill that made him feel as though the desert was whispering its secrets directly to him. By the 3rd month, army officers were visibly unsettled. They staged a test where 10 seasoned guards watched a 100-yard clearing, told a single man would attempt to cross. For 3 hours, the guards peered into the moonlight, their fingers white on triggers, but they saw nothing. It was only when Naki stood up directly behind the lead sergeant and placed a firm hand on his shoulder that the officers realized the clearing had been crossed 40 minutes earlier. Naki had not used a weapon. He had simply become part of the night. The observers realized they were no longer looking at a scout, but a psychological force. As training drew to a close, the elders painted Naki's face with patterns of ash that seemed to absorb the light around him. They told him he was a guardian of a tradition of protection. He was ready to be sent across the Atlantic, carrying a quiet strength to collide with an industrial war machine. The transition from dry heat to damp, ancient forests was imminent, and the passing of his old life was complete. The American generals believed they were sending a secret weapon to the front lines, but they had no idea how deeply Naki would penetrate the enemy's psyche. As he boarded the transport ship, he realized his hands were no longer meant for the shepherd's staff, but for a mission that would change the way the enemy viewed the very air they breathed. If you want to uncover the secrets history tried to bury, hit that subscribe button. The algorithm often hides these stories, and your support is the only way we keep the record alive. The German soldiers of the 12th Saint-Saëns Panzer Division thought they knew the Ardennes. They did not realize the forest had just gained a soul. When Naki Yazi stepped off the transport truck in late 1944, the world felt fundamentally broken. The air was thick with the metallic tang of distant artillery, a jarring contrast to the sagebrush and parched earth he had carried in his lungs for 20 years. To the American officers, this forest was a logistical nightmare, but as Naki looked into the charcoal greys of the woods, he did not see an obstacle. He saw a sanctuary that felt strangely familiar, as if the spirits of his own mountains had followed him across the ocean. Naki began to modify his equipment, stripping away anything that made a sound. He replaced regulation footwear with soft-wrapped soles that allowed him to feel the texture of the frozen ground. His first mission was a solo reconnaissance into a sector labeled as a dead zone because intelligence was suppressed. The Germans had established a hidden supply line, allowing them to reinforce positions, yet aerial photographs showed only a canopy of unbroken trees. The generals were frustrated, but Naki simply asked for a compass, a wool blanket, and permission to move at his own pace. As he slipped into the tree line, he vanished before he had traveled 30 feet. For the next 48 hours, Naki became a ghost in the machine of the European war. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, pausing for hours to listen to the rhythm of the woods. He noticed the way birds fell silent, and the way morning mist hung differently over a hidden road. He found the German supply route by sensing the subtle bruising of the forest, the way a snapped twig or flattened moss told the story of an army hiding its tracks. He sat within 20 feet of a German sentry post, hearing the men cough and seeing the steam rising from their coffee. Yet he remained as immovable as the ancient trees. By the time he returned, he carried an intimate understanding of the enemy's heartbeat. He had mapped the hidden network in his mind, noting the timing of rotations and fuel depots. Intelligence officers were stunned, but Naki remained humble, speaking only of how the forest had helped him. He proved that advanced military technology was no match for a man who knew how to listen to the silence. American command now had the information to strike, but for the German soldiers, the nightmare was only beginning. They started to feel a presence in the woods they could not name, a sensation that the shadows were watching their every move. It started with a missing sentry and a single strange marking on a tree. German soldiers were entirely unprepared for the sound of absolute nothingness. Within a week of Naki's arrival, the psychological atmosphere changed. One morning, a high-ranking officer woke to find his map cases moved from his bedside to the center of the camp, while guards swore not a single soul had passed the perimeter. Naki had begun the process of unraveling the enemy. He understood that a man's greatest vulnerability is his imagination. He would slip into enemy encampments at 3 o'clock in the morning, flowing around the light of campfires like water around a stone. He practiced the art of the ghost mark. Using charcoal or flint, he would leave a traditional Apache symbol on a tent flap or the stock of a leaning rifle. These symbols were not aggressive, but their presence was a profound psychological blow. It sent a message louder than any explosion. You are within my reach, and you did not even know I was here. German soldiers found themselves looking over their shoulders at every snap of a twig. They began to whisper about a Schwarzer Geist that possessed the ability to walk through walls. In intercepted letters, the tone shifted from the bravado of conquerors to the trembling uncertainty of the hunted. American commanders watched intelligence reports with disbelief, realizing one man was doing more to dismantle morale than 1,000 rounds of artillery. Naki remained a figure of quiet solitude, cleaning the mud from his boots with the same care he used when tending sheep. He did not boast. To him, this was simply the duty of a protector to ensure fewer of his friends faced the end of their lives. He was weaving a tapestry of fear as a surgical tool to end the conflict quickly. He taught the German command that thick armor meant nothing if the man behind the machine was too terrified to sleep. As days grew shorter, the whispers in the trenches turned into a pervasive dread. The soldiers realized they were not just fighting an army, but a legend growing more powerful with every sunset. Tell me, what do you think is the most powerful weapon a soldier can carry? His rifle or the peace within his own soul? Comment below with your thoughts and let us know where you are joining us from today. In the German trenches, men began to pray for sunrise. Beneath a moon obscured by snow clouds, Naki identified a fortified command post in a stone farmhouse. The perimeter was ringed with barbed wire and patrolled by triple-strength sentry units. Yet to Naki, these defenses were merely a puzzle of light and sound. He did not carry a rifle, choosing instead the quiet confidence of his ancestors. He moved past outer guards by timing his movements to the crunch of their boots on frozen snow, sliding through shadows like a breath of wind. When he reached the farmhouse, he did not seek to cause an end to anyone's life. Instead, he sought to steal their certainty. He slipped through a cellar window and moved into the heart of the command center. There, in a room where 3 high-ranking officers lay asleep, Naki performed an act of psychological theater. With movements as precise as a watchmaker's, he rearranged the maps on their oak table, rotating the orientation of the front lines and swapping the pins that marked troop movements. On the center of the primary tactical map, he placed a smooth river stone he had carried from Arizona, resting it directly atop the symbol for German headquarters. Before departing, he took the officers' iron keys and placed them in the kitchen sink, submerged in a cold bowl of water. When the officers awoke, they found their world literally turned upside down. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken locks, only the terrifying realization that a stranger had stood over them while they slept. The fallout was more effective than a 1,000-pound bomb. The German commander reportedly suffered a nervous collapse, convinced he was hunted by a supernatural force. The story spread like wildfire, and the stone from Arizona became a symbol of a warrior who did not need to spill blood to win a battle. Naki had conquered the enemy's mind without firing a single shot. He returned to his own lines as the first light of dawn touched the trees, his face expressionless, but his heart heavy with the weight of his role. The legend of the Schwarzer Geist had now reached the highest levels of command, and a bounty was whispered to be placed on the shadow in the woods. Little did they know, the man they feared was currently sitting by a small stove, thinking of the warm sun on the mesas of his youth. By mid-1944, the German High Command had a new name for the shadow, der Schwarze Geist. Isolated reports of missing equipment had grown into a psychological epidemic. German military culture found itself utterly defenseless. Officers reported men refused, night watch alone, preferring court-martial to being marked. Intercepted letters describe a haunting terror. One corporal wrote that he felt the very moonlight had been weaponized. The legend was fueled by Naki's mastery and the enemy's internal collapse. Naki would spend 12 hours tucked into a rotted log, watching a German artillery battery with such stillness that spiders wove webs across his shoulders. He learned the names of soldiers by listening to their conversations and used this knowledge to sow discord. He might leave a letter from a soldier's sweetheart on the seat of a truck, locked from the inside. These were acts of surrounding their spirits with the impossible. German command deployed elite trackers who had hunted wolves in the Black Forest, but they were no match for the descendant of Apache scouts. Naki treated these encounters like a game of chess. He would lead trackers in circles, stepping in his own footprints, or moving across frozen streams to break the trail, only to appear behind them and leave a carved wooden stick in the snow. This was the ghost mark in its most potent form, a reminder that the predator had become the prey. Germans began to believe the American army unleashed an ancient force, and the propaganda of the master race crumbled as they realized they were being outmaneuvered by a man whose culture they had dismissed. While the enemy saw a demon, his American comrades saw a man who would share rations with local families. He would leave small carvings of desert animals for children, a quiet sign that in the midst of a global tragedy, there was still a place for beauty. He was becoming a legend on both sides, serving a country that had not always served his people. The psychological weight of the black spirit created a vacuum of leadership. However, the most dangerous moment was still ahead, waiting at a vital river crossing where the silence of the woods would finally be broken by the roar of the coming storm. Stories like Naki's are often lost in the footnotes. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, please share this video with a friend who appreciates the hidden truths of our past. Every legend has its moment of truth, and for Naki Yazi, it was a bridge that should not have been standing. A vital crossing over the Our River became the focal point of a struggle. The German command had prepared to demolish the stone structure, with combat engineers wiring the foundations with high explosives. To American generals, the bridge appeared lost, but where an entire company saw a wall of fire, Naki saw a landscape that needed a protector. Under the cover of a biting sleet storm, Naki moved toward the riverbank. He entered the freezing, waist-deep water, hundreds of yards upstream. He moved with the slow patience of the river, keeping only his eyes and nose above the surface, camouflaged by debris. For 2 hours he navigated the currents until he was directly beneath the arches. Above him, he could hear the thud of German boots and the metallic clink of engineers securing charges. He was so close that the vibration of their voices resonated in the stones he clung to, yet he remained as invisible as a shadow in a windowless room. Working in total darkness, with fingers numbed by ice, Naki began to use the traditional skills he had learned as a boy. He systematically traced the wire leads that ran from detonators to primary charges. With the precision of a surgeon, he rerouted the wires into the damp mud of the riverbank, ensuring that when the German officer finally pressed the plunger, the electrical current would be swallowed by the earth. To further complicate efforts, he used a piece of twine to create decoys. As the first light of dawn broke, American tanks appeared. The German commander gave the order to blow the bridge, and the plunger was depressed. Nothing happened. A second attempt followed, then a third. But the stone remained, defiant. In the ensuing confusion, German soldiers began to panic. They looked down into the mist, convinced the bridge itself was cursed. By the time they realized the sabotage was the work of a man, the American vanguard was upon them. Naki had saved the bridge and ensured the safety of hundreds of soldiers who would have been caught in a bottleneck. The bridge stood firm, a silent monument to a warrior who fought with his mind. But as the tide turned, Naki realized the most difficult transition was the journey back to the man he used to be. The war was ending, but for Naki Yazzie, the silence was becoming permanent. As the spring of 1945 thawed the ground, the thunder of the front lines moved further into the distance. For over a year, Naki had lived as a shadow, training his heart to beat in rhythm with the forest. He had become so adept at disappearance that he often found it difficult to reappear, even when surrounded by his own brothers. At night, while others celebrated with laughter, Naki would sit on the periphery of the firelight, his eyes fixed on the tree line, as if waiting for a signal only he could hear. The emotional weight of being a ghost was beginning to take its toll. He had spent so long inhabiting the psyche of the enemy that the boundaries of his identity felt frayed. He could no longer sleep in a building with a ceiling. The enclosure felt like a trap. His fellow soldiers treated him with reverent distance, aware he had moved through spaces where no other man could survive. But that respect only deepened his isolation. He began to struggle to remember the sound of his mother's voice, or the smell of the summer rain hitting parched Arizona dust. It was as if the damp air had muffled his memories, replacing the colors of the desert with muted grays of a continent that had seen too much loss of life. One afternoon, in a liberated village, he saw an elderly woman tending a patch of flowers amidst the rubble. She moved with a gentle grace that reminded him of his grandmother. He realized then that while he had been sent to Europe to be a weapon, he had never lost the heart of a protector. He had used ancient wisdom to save lives, but the cost had been a piece of his own spirit left behind. He understood that the passing of the war did not mean the ending of his mission. He now had to find a way to lead his own soul back. He began to carry a piece of pine bark in his pocket, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger whenever he felt himself slipping into the stillness. It was a grounding ritual to remind himself he was a man of flesh and bone. He knew the journey home would require a total reconstruction of his world. As the official surrender was signed, Naki looked at his reflection in a pool of rainwater and barely recognized the man looking back. He had saved a continent, yet he was about to face a bureaucracy that wanted to ensure his story remained as invisible as he had been in the forest. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the men with medals marched home, but the shadows were invited to vanish. As the military began demobilization, a strange atmosphere settled over specialized units. For Naki Yazi, victory parades felt like events on a different planet. While others were receiving bronze stars, Naki was summoned to a nondescript office near Frankfurt. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds. There were only two men in sharp suits and paperwork designed to erase the last 3 years of his existence. The military was faced with a heartbreaking dilemma. They had created a warrior whose skills were so effective that acknowledging his existence meant admitting to a type of warfare that did not fit the heroic narrative. An officer explained that his service records were being reclassified. Every mission, every bridge saved by silent sabotage, was being moved to a vault. Naki watched as a heavy red stamp was pressed onto his file, bearing a single word that felt like a sentence: restricted. He was told in no uncertain terms that the things he had seen were never to be discussed. The transition was abrupt. One day, he was the most feared individual in a sector, and the next, he was just another young man in a worn jacket on a pier in New York City with a bus ticket to Arizona. There were no official records of his specialized training. To the Department of Veterans Affairs, he was simply an infantryman who had served with unremarkable distinction. The government had utilized the sacred traditions of his ancestors and then asked him to return to anonymity. As he sat on the bus traveling west, watching green fields give way to rugged red landscapes, Naki felt a strange sense of peace. He realized that while the government could erase ink on a page, they could not erase the truth held within the land. He did not need a medal to know what he had done, and he did not need a parade to know that he had protected his brothers. He arrived at the edge of the reservation as the sun was setting, the air finally smelling of cedar. He stepped off the bus and began the long walk toward his family's hogan, his footsteps still as silent as they had been in Europe. He was home, but he carried a secret that would remain buried for over half a century, waiting for a future generation to uncover the truth of the shadow who saved the light. Decades later, a young boy on the reservation found a rusted German iron cross tucked away in the bottom of his grandfather's old cedar trunk. For 50 years, Naki Yazi had lived a life of profound quiet, returning to the high deserts not as a hero, but as the shepherd who had left in 1941. He had married, raised children, and watched his grandchildren play among the mesas where he had first learned to listen to the wind, never once speaking of the Ardennes. To his neighbors, he was simply a grandfather who could track a mountain lion across bare rock and who always seemed to sense a storm coming. The legacy only began to emerge in the late 90s, when declassified documents hinted at a specialized scout program. Researchers found reports describing a presence that caused the surrender of German battalions without a single shot. When historians tracked the records back to a small house on the reservation, they found a man in his 80s whose eyes still held the sharpness of a hawk. Naki remained hesitant, but as he looked at the younger generation, he realized the story belonged to his people, and the memory of those who passed away in the shadows. He began to share his story as an account of a protector. He spoke of how ancient Apache values allowed him to succeed where military might have failed. The most heartwarming revelation was the letters he had kept from fellow American soldiers whose lives he had shielded. These men wrote of the guardian angel they never saw, but always felt. The rusted iron cross was not a trophy of destruction. It was a reminder of a night when he had chosen to spare a life, proving that real strength is found in mercy. Naki Yazi departed from this world in 2004, surrounded by his family. He was finally laid to rest with full military honors. He proved that even when history tries to erase a name, truth rises like the morning sun over canyon walls. Naki Yazi carried the weight of a continent's freedom in total silence, proving that the greatest heroes are those who never ask for the spotlight. If you believe these forgotten chapters deserve to be remembered, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our community. It is the only way we can ensure that names like Naki's are never lost to the shadows again. Thank you for watching,